Hey y'all, Devin the Albino Jackass here, coming at you with the history of country music, part 2. So, in the last episode, we talked about the Carter family and Jimmy Rogers and the foundation of country music. We talked a little bit about the evolution of the singing cowboy, how that evolved into Texas swing, and how that evolved into honky-tonk music, and how that led us to Hank Williams, who really took all of that and combined it to create modern country music. And a couple of things I forgot to cover in my last video. I want to talk about the history and evolution of bluegrass a little bit. So bluegrass grew out of, again, old-time string music. And this was really formed by Bill Monroe. He's known as the father of bluegrass. And he took the traditional old-time string music sound and tweaked it a little bit. He added what's called a Scruggs-style banjo, which was invented, obviously, by a man named Earl Scruggs. And what that is, it's a three-finger picking style, whereas before you would typically only use two. So that, of course, it increased the speed of the banjo playing. It went from a lot simpler to kind of think dueling banjos would be a good example of a Scruggs-style banjo. And if you want an example of old-time string music, I mentioned this in my last video, go back and listen to Old Crow Medicine Show. Another unique aspect to bluegrass was the very choppy mandolin. No one had ever really put the mandolin as the lead instrument before. And the last key component to bluegrass is the vocal style, and which is called the high lonesome sound, which would be a little bit like, "I," that very poorly done, but you go very high and then drop really quickly. And all of these elements combined seem to give a much older sound to the music. It sounded a lot older than it actually was. It seemed to give the music new depth. And it's honestly one of the most beautiful, pure music genres that I've ever heard, bluegrass. It takes the sincerity and authenticity that you would expect from country music, and it strips it down into this wonderful melodic tune. It's musical emotions, and it's really, really great. But now I want to move in to talk a little bit about barn dances. And basically what these were radio variety shows. And the biggest one, of course, is WSM's Grand Ole Opry. You can listen to it on 6:50 a.m. And basically this started in 1925. It's the longest running radio show in American history. And this is sort of the mother church of country music. Almost everyone throughout history, from the Carter family and Roy Acuff, all the way up to Brad Paisley and Trace Adkins and even Eric Church. All of them, it's a rite of passage. You got to get on the Opry, even today. And it really was the main spreader of country music back then. It really brought it to a national audience in a way that just had never been done up until that point. And it really took off in the 30s. With the onset of the Great Depression, as I mentioned in my last episode, a lot of people switched from buying records to listening to the radio, because the music you got from the radio was free. A funny story about that, my grandfather actually grew up during the Depression, and he said that they wouldn't listen to the radio much during the week. They would save the battery for Saturday night so they could listen to the Grand Ole Opry. So it had a real cultural significance. People would say your neighbors didn't have a radio and you did, they would all gather at your house to listen to the Opry. And that is how big it got, and it still is in a lot of ways. But the Opry was big. Now, another one that doesn't get talked about as much is the Louisiana Hayride. And the Louisiana Hayride gave the start to a lot of different musicians, from Hank Williams, Webb Pierce, Farron Young, Johnny Horton, Johnny Cash, and even Elvis Presley and Jerry Lee Lewis all started out on the Louisiana Hayride. So a good way to think about it would be the Louisiana Hayride is sort of like the NCAA, and the Grand Ole Opry is the NFL. So those are two quick things I wanted to touch on. Now, and also the Louisiana Hayride was the starting point for Miss Kitty Wells, one of the first female country singers to really get popular. Her song, It Wasn't God That Made Honky Tonk Angels, was a response to a Hank Thompson song called I Didn't Know God Made Honky Tonk Angels. And it was really the first woman's anthem in country music. So the Louisiana Hayride really helped spark her careers and really opened the gateway for women to enter country music in the late 40s and early 50s. So moving on to after the death of Hank Williams, we're going to talk about Ray Price and the honky-tonk style of music that Hank popularized. So again, honky-tonk music had really kind of taken over as the most popular form of country music. It was rougher, it was harder sounding, and I mentioned in my last video that I consider Hank Williams to be the first rock and roller. And in a lot of ways that's true, but in a lot of ways it's not. Hank is still very much country music. There's still a fiddle, a pedal guitar, the bass line is still pretty slow. But after the death of Hank Williams, Ray Price, who was sort of one of Hank's disciples, they actually lived together for a time, took Hank's style of honky-tonk and added what's called a double tap bass. So in a lot of country music before this, you would get sort of a tick-tock with the bass line. Ray Price comes in and he adds what's called, again, the double tap bass, which is tick-tock, 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 tick-tock. So it sped up a little bit, gave it a little bit of a harder sound, and we're moving a little closer to rock and roll. But this is still firmly in country music. It's double fiddle, stand-up bass, pedal steel guitar, electric guitar, and acoustic. So this is sort of the most popular era of country music. You had people like Webb Pierce, Faron Young, George Jones, even Patsy Cline got her start at this point singing honky-tonk music. So this is 1953, 1954. Now, once rock and roll hits is really when country music begins to change, because the style and more importantly, the sales collapse overnight. Hank had really began something with country music that was new, and it was young people that listened to Hank, and it was young people that listened to Ray Price, who, again, his baritone is considered one of the best to ever grace country music. And he was sort of the hardcore defender of the honky-tonk sound at this point, because once rock and roll hit, Nashville record producers started to panic. And what they started to do was take away the steel guitar, put a little less emphasis on it, turn the fiddle style of playing and make it more of a violin. They brought in an orchestra. And it was really the beginning of the fusion of country music and pop music. And this is really when Willie Nelson actually starts to pop up. It's really when Patsy Cline begins to take off. And if you want a good example of what would become the Nashville sound, listen to Jim Reeves, He'll Have to Go. It was it almost sounded like something you would hear in Fallout, kind of like a Nat King Cole kind of sound to it. Now, it still had a pedal steel, but again, it wasn't emphasized as much. And this was trying to do was gear these pop fans who just couldn't stand rock and roll, that maybe if they changed the arrangement, they might give country a listen. And this was one of the first real big controversies in country music, because a lot of people felt like country music was selling its soul in the late 50s and early 60s. You had people like George Jones, Ray Price, and these were sort of the defenders of the honky-tonk style of music. Lefty Frizzell was another one. But people like Jim Reeves, Faron Young, even Willie Nelson and Patsy Cline began to shift more toward what's called that Nashville sound, that highly orchestrated, poppy-sounding country music. And this continued into the 60s. This style of country music continued to gain popularity, and honky-tonk started to die. Now, when Ray Price released For the Good Times, this was almost as controversial as Dylan going electric, because Ray Price converted to that Nashville sound, and this was sort of the beginning of outlaw country. I mentioned Willie Nelson. Willie Nelson had written songs for Patsy Cline, for Faron Young, for a lot of different country singers throughout the 50s and 60s, and he never really had much success at this point. And Willie Nelson was not a big fan of the highly polished and produced way that Nashville had been doing things by this time. So Waylon Jennings is another one. So before we get into outlaw country, I want to rewind and talk a little bit about the birth of rock and roll and a couple of the other subgenres that spawned. So a lot of you know that Elvis Presley started out as sort of a country artist. He started out on the Louisiana Hayride and actually did perform on the Grand Ole Opry once, and he was actually booed off stage. So imagine that. Elvis Presley had been booed off stage. I mean, that's... Again, the Opry in country audiences were very conservative. They were very traditional values. So they were completely turned off for rock and roll, boo Elvis Presley off stage. Now, Johnny Cash Elvis Presley and Jerry Lee Lewis all were signed by the same record company, Sun Records, in Memphis, Tennessee. Now, Johnny Cash managed to create, or had a hand in creating what's called rockabilly. And this is sort of a combination of rock and country. And if you want a good example of rockabilly, think early Johnny Cash or Johnny Horton. Listen to Honky Tonk Hardwood Floor. That's a really good example of rockabilly. And this was sort of not quite the beginnings of punk rock, but you can see how it would turn into that. So that's a little wisdom nugget for you. But getting back to the main topic, in the late 60s and early 70s, you start to have kind of the backlash to this Nashville poppy-sounding country music with the likes of Jim Reeves and Patsy Cline. You have Loretta Lynn step in at this time, and she is, again, playing honky-tonk music at first. Conway Twitty comes in about this time. Now, he had his first real big hit way back in the 50s with It's Only Make Believe, but he really had trouble finding success until the late 60s. Now, country music, again, by this point is becoming more and more poppy. So people like Waylon Jennings, Willie Nelson, Kris Kristofferson, they leave Nashville and go out to Texas. And think David Allan Coe as well. And these guys form what's called outlaw country. And this is kind of like country's version of punk rock. It is a direct middle finger to the produced and polished sound of Nashville. And the real big founders of this, again, are Willie Nelson, Waylon Jennings, Johnny Cash, and Kris Kristofferson, the four that would later form the Highwaymen. And this was a lot different. This was, again, a much rougher sound to country music. This was blunt. This was not like the honky-tonk music that had came before. This was counterculture in a lot of ways. Counterculture had found its way into country music, and this is the beginning and really the golden era of outlaw country. And this is significant because it's the first real time that you have a true schism in country music. Now, you'd always had sort of subgenres and that kind of thing, but this was a real schism over the heart and soul of what country music is. And that battle is still being fought out today. And is country music going to keep that genuine authenticity that it has kept since its foundation, the Carter family, Jimmie Rodgers, Roy Acuff, going into Ernest Tubb and Hank Williams? Or are we going to go down the way of Alabama and that kind of genre of country music? And it seems that the pop has won out. And I end the history of country music with the outlaw movement because it's really at this point that, you start to have disco influences come in. You start to have a bunch of different molds with country music until the mid to late 80s. And you have what's called neo-traditional country music. And this is the likes of Don Williams, think Alan Jackson and George Strait. These guys come along and they try to bring country music back to what it was before, sort of a pedal steel, a fiddle. But something, and I think I had mentioned this earlier, but the Opry didn't allow drums until the 60s or 70s. That was another big change in country music, and especially in outlaw country, was that they embraced drums, they embraced electrified instruments, and it sort of helped lead the way into Southern rock as well, did outlaw country. But Willie Nelson and these guys were really sort of the last hurrah of the true spirit of country music, and Alan Jackson and George Strait and all those guys were the final remnant of the true, authentic, genuine country sound. And that brings us to the modern day, and it really started with Garth Brooks in the 90s. He made his concerts more of a spectacle. And this was terrible for country music, and the pop influence continued to get worse, and then in the 2000s you started to incorporate like hip-hop beats into it, until you get to the point now that it's so diluted, I can't even call it country music anymore. Like the likes of Luke Bryan and Florida Georgia Line, these are not country acts, these are pop acts with a southern accent. And that pretty much brings us to the end of the history of country music. And I want to talk about the decline that began in the 50s and in the 60s after rock and roll hit. So, as a lot of you know, rock and roll is controversial on its own, and there's a reason for that. And that is, it really stripped away any sort of complexity or subtlety to art in a way that I don't think it's ever really recovered from. And you can see that just not only in country music, but in pop music as well. And there are other reasons for this. A big reason that a lot of modern pop music sucks is it's all produced and written by about the same 12 people. This happens in country music too. And that's another big problem, is a lot of them have the same producers, and so a lot of these songs sound the same. I call it syndicated record producing, because when I was a janitor at Kohl's, for example, the modern pop music they would play, I could not tell you one song from the other. And country music has gotten this way as well. And I think it's important that you understand the history of country music so you can understand how far our culture in general has fallen. Country music is just a good example of it. We started out from songs that were 200, 300 years old. These were songs of early American life and what those people went through and their experiences. And that evolved into people writing their own stories and their own experiences and putting all of their energy and time into this music in a way that is uniquely American for country music. It's not anything other than pure Americana, because these songs were written by and for Americans who were going through these same things. And it stayed that way well into the modern day, and it's unfortunately dying out now. And you look back at all the great artists, from A.P. Carter and what he managed to do with preserving this treasure trove of American literature. And Acuff, the same thing, and about how they were able to preserve all these old-fashioned styles and also able to create something new out of them. If country music doesn't exist, I don't know that modern music as we know it exists, because of the impact it had on people's personal lives, the impact it had on their artistic lives. I mentioned it in my last video with Hank Williams in particular. Almost every famous artist you can think of has covered a Hank Williams song at one point. Johnny Cash influenced generations of artists. Webb Pierce, Faron Young, Ray Price, all of these guys did the same thing. And it's a real shame that the spirit of the music that these guys laid the groundwork for is pretty much being washed away now in pursuit of the almighty dollar. And that's the real problem with not just country music, but our culture as a whole. It's all become syndicated and desperate for a cash grab. All the movies look the same, all the shows are the same, all the music sounds the same. And it's a real shame, because the American musical history is one of the most proud in the world. We've created so many different genres and subgenres of music. We've produced so many great songwriters and musicians. It's unbelievable, all out of this one genre of music. So let alone all the countless other genres that have produced wonderful works. And that's why I think country music needs to be preserved, understood, and appreciated. Because a lot of you out there might be thinking, oh, it's just all about your dog and your wife leaving you. And that's not it. That's not what country music is about. It's about genuine, heartfelt things that people are going through. It's deeply personal experiences. It's things that everyone can relate to. Country music is also great at emphasizing American values. Country music always has. Roy Acuff, he's got plenty. Go back and listen to some of his songs that he released during the war years, from Smoke on the Water to Advice to Joe. There's a bunch of good patriotic songs in there. Ain't I Right by Marty Robbins, And it's a shame that our music has deteriorated to this point, because these wonderful works of art that should be remembered and preserved. And country music's always been good at taking something that's old and making it new again. That's what we need to see. These artists want to bring country music back. What we need to do is start recreating the old style, that old honky-tonk style. We can bring it and modernize it. And I know that a lot of these artists have great experiences they can pour into their music in the way that Hank and Ray and George and Johnny did. Even the Nashville sound, as poppy as it was, is still beautiful. Because it still tries to keep authenticity. Outlaw country is beautiful because it's in your face, it's unapologetic, it's the punk rock of country music. It's punk country, And that's what I want to see brought back. I want to see the authenticity brought back. I want to see the diversity in musical styles. Even though a lot of these guys played honky-tonk styles, they had their own unique sounds. You can tell Ray Price from Lefty Frizzell. You can tell Faron Young from George Jones. You can tell Johnny Cash from pretty much anyone else. And, Johnny Cash is right up there with Hank Williams in terms of his importance. Again, he came out and he was unapologetic in what he was going through with his addiction issues and his marital issues, and he put all of that into his music. And he influenced generations. In other genres, I think Snoop Dogg honestly comes close, especially his early stuff. A lot of those early rappers, it's what made gangster rap so good. It was their experiences and what they went through growing up. So it doesn't necessarily matter if it's country. People love genuine, authentic experiences that they can relate to. And that's always what country music has been about, up until this modern day. And now we've got hip-hop beats and auto-tuning, and it's just awful, and it just violates the spirit of country music. But I would love to hear your all's thoughts down below. I'll probably do a mop-up part on this series because I enjoy talking about this subject. We'll probably do a deeper dive into individual artists because I want to cover Johnny Cash, I want to cover Hank Williams, I want to cover George Jones in greater detail. They all deserve their own videos. But I think that's where we're going to wrap this video up. Be sure to let me know what you guys thought down in the comments below. Be sure to like, share, subscribe. I've been the Albino Jackass. Thanks for listening to me, Hee Haw. Have a great day, y'all.